I really value this opportunity because I want to put two big messages across to you. The first is, the world we all live in is changing significantly. And everybody in this room of any age or experience will have come along this morning with a sense of how their lives are operating, and their expectations and their sense of how the world works. And we need to talk about how that is going to be different for the rest of your life, no matter if you're in this room at 20 or 120. And the second thing is, there is absolutely no way the United Kingdom is going to secure itself, prosper, have a voice in the world, unless it connects civil society to that challenge. And that is you. There isn't another you. There is only you and the people like you. Whether you actually join the reserves or you support the cadet forces as an adult instructor, and that for me is absolutely vital ground. But most particularly, if you're an employer, and many of you are in this room, this matters to you because you employ the people who are going to be the reserves that contribute to the armed forces. And you as employers are now on the pitch in the way that nations confront each other. And so this is a matter for me of acute self-interest, that you understand the problem and how you have to contribute to it. So what I'm going to do is to follow broadly this agenda. Yeah, there we are. So I'm going to talk about how this world is changing, and I'm hoping a lot of that is becoming common ground for you. Then I'm going to get a little more technical. I'll try and moderate that a bit. To talk about how the way war is fought, how conflict is conducted is changing. And in the way that it's changing, the only solution for the UK is you. And then I'm going to talk specifically about what this means for the reserve. And when I use the label reserve, I don't just mean the people who wear uniforms and go Army, Navy, Air Force at the weekends or indeed when they're mobilised. I mean the employers and the families that make that possible. Because it doesn't work if we don't all see ourselves as part of the reserve community. I'm going to try and do that in 40 minutes. I'm not good at shutting up, but I'll try and do it in 40 minutes and then leave time for some discussion. So, on this picture, I'm trying to capture why you might feel like you do and how it is very different. If you think about the history of the United Kingdom, going back into the last century and even beyond that, as a country, we were quite familiar with the idea of existential peril, that people wanted to go to war to us, they wanted to crush the existence of the state, and indeed those of our friends, and we were part of a world which was quite martial. So of course, empire including that, but culturally we think of the First World War as a major national effort with the future of the country at stake. A shortish pause, where we wanted this to go away, then the Second World War, essentially a continuation of that. Again, the future of the country at stake. And just this this month, where we've been commemorating D-Day, which is now 80 years ago, with the veterans who survived of that time. This is part of our national sense. And then many of you remember we then fell into the Cold War, where for a generation essentially we were worried about the Soviet Union, and we were locked in what felt like a struggle to the death for how the world works and for our existence. And that sense of struggle may have dissipated as things stabilised through particularly the 80s. But it was about dealing with existential peril. And then this moment appeared, and this is easier to understand looking back. In 1989, the Cold War ended. And for many of you in this room, that's when I guess many of you started to enter the adult world. And the remarkable thing about the end of the Cold War was that for the first time for a very long time, we didn't worry at an existential level about our security. No one was going to invade us. We weren't in imminent danger of a civil war. In fact, many in Europe got so carried away with the collapse of the Soviet Union that they began to declare that we had grown out of conflict, that finally, at least this bit of humanity had evolved to the point where we weren't going to fight for states or borders or territory any longer. That may happen in other less developed parts of the world, wasn't going to happen. That was, I thought at the time, a mental thing to say, and definitely historically naive. But it then explains that from about 1990 until I'm going to use 2014 as an end date, the armed forces of the United Kingdom were in a place that was really uncomfortable and unfamiliar. So, broadly speaking, there was about 10 years of the Balkans, which was a complete surprise. And we talked about the responsibility to protect and the need to be a force for good in a quite Blairite way. And then Gulf War I, 1991, that was a surprise, but was regarded as an aberration. And then 9/11, and then the Iraq-Afghan decades, counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency, drifting into nation building, and has left a lack of enthusiasm for that kind of thing, which we should recognise, because neither of those operations were strategically successful. But for the armed forces of that time, it left a legacy that war was an away match, essentially, that you took largely the regular armed forces in a small number of reserves, if you really must, and you went to, when you wanted to somebody else's country to conduct an operation against an enemy that wasn't like Russia, so it didn't have an air force or certainly in Afghanistan a navy, or missiles or artillery or tanks. This was against an insurgency, mostly, machine guns, bombs, rockets, that kind of thing. But operations bounded by time and cost and risk, and you could decide when to start, and you could decide when to finish. Neither very successful. At no time in that period of 30 years or so was it necessary to protect the UK homeland. Nor to worry, therefore, about the resilience of the country, or to mobilise civil society, or mobilise our economy. These were things where security had been outsourced to a professional, quite small and constantly getting smaller armed forces. And then when we decided we weren't going to do that anymore, there was the thought, well, we've grown out of existential conflict, and we're not going to do discretionary intervention any longer, which is just as well, because in that period we decided to spend all our money on our health, our welfare, and our education in the beneficial and comfortable explosion of our public sector after 1990. And then the world changed. We didn't want it to change. It's not in our interests, but it's changed. I'm going to use one benchmark, which is 2014, which is the Russian invasion of Crimea, and you can see the extension of that in the war in Ukraine now. But the right-hand end of this slide captures the nature of the problem we're going to talk about. The first thing is, we're back to dealing with a combination of existential risk, unprecedented in the history of humanity, and I'm going to talk more about that. That means that the things we haven't had to think about for more than 30 years, like the protection of our homeland, our security, our prosperity, our values, back on the agenda from a position of some disadvantage, because not only are our armed forces at the extremely low ebb that 30 years of post-Cold War era has left it in, but so are our politics, because we've only had to work at the margin, and so is civil society in the way that, and this is you, in the way that you think about your resilience and your expectations of immunity from harm and freedoms and access to good things. But this is now a profoundly different and difficult conversation. And if I had to put it in a couple of sentences, we are back again, and we didn't ask for it, to having to manage existential risk to the state, to our families, to our communities, to our interests. And we've no familiarity with that, and we have no institutional memory nor much preparation for that. And we are approaching that, we are in this point now, so our political leaders talk about us being pre-war, and I'll give you a sense of why I think that is so. With the armed forces, the civil society and the government that we've ended up with as a result of that comfortable, different 30 years. That's a massive gap. And the choice, and it's your choice, it's not my choice, it's your choice, is how quickly and how well you close that gap in your own interests. And that's where we're going to see some of that play out in this election and what happens. For the army, specifically, you can see that struggle play out in the history of an army, which is broadly in my lifetime. So an army in the Cold War, I did 10 years of the Cold War, about 150,000, where almost all of the army every day was ready nearly all the time. So I lived in Germany. I couldn't go more than 2 hours ever from my barracks unless I was on leave. If the engine in my track vehicle broke and it was a Sunday, it got fixed on a Sunday. And then that ended. Then there was a period of uncertainty, which was essentially Bosnia and Kosovo, and then 9/11, and then the army that retuned itself for those wars of a particular type in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you can see the numbers, actually better than I can, on the slide. You can see the reduction in regular and reserve as you go through that 30 years. Because, let's be honest, why would you pay for large armed forces if you couldn't see what the point was? What's the enemy you're trying to deal with? Which brings us to the right-hand end of this slide. A regular army of about 73,000, getting smaller every month because the number of people that leave is bigger than the number of people that enter, true for all three armed forces. And by our historical standards, a tiny, much neglected reserve, and a great deal of uncertainty about how all of that's going to work. And that is the truth of the picture as we roll into the election that we're going to have as a society, that we have armed forces that, for reasons that chart explains but no longer excuses, are in the state they're in because of the journey travelled through the post-Cold War era. And in every single dimension, they are not ready, and you're not ready, for the world that we are now face. And the question is, well, why is that? But what are we going to do about it? So let's talk a bit more about the army. And I'm not going to dwell on this because this is mostly of interest to those in the reserves. So I know if you're in the reserves today, it feels hard. A shortage of people, shortage of attention, shortage of money, shortage of equipment, shortage of training, and a sense of how do we fit in and where do we belong. Well, this explains why you feel like you do. So let's be honest about it. But for all the reasons I've started to describe, that isn't going to work. So the point about days like today is this has to be put right, because it's vital, not because it's discretionary, and it may take a bit of time and a bit of money. But if you're in the reserves today, and when I say reserves, I mean the people who put uniform on, the families and the employers. So you're in the reserves today. You are going to find, inevitably, in my view, over the coming years, that we are going to end up in a much different, better and important place. And the question is, how quickly and how well can we do that? So let's talk a little bit more about the threat. So this is why I argue with you that the risk that mankind, if I can use that word, humanity I think I meant to say, is facing an unprecedented risk to its existence. Not to the nice things, but to existence. The first thing is we've returned to an era of multipolarity. So we were used to a world led by a single superpower, the US, and institutions designed pretty much by the West, UN, IMF, that kind of thing. And some held that liberal democracy and free market economy was the recipe that humanity had alighted on, and it was inevitably going to triumph globally. Well, it didn't work. And we now are back to an era where you have essentially two large blocs: liberal democracy led by the US, probably, autocratic capitalists led by China, but with Russia as the rather noisy and difficult child in the way right now. And then a whole lot of the rest of the world. I'm not allowed to use the expression global south, but the global south, Africa and Asia, looking on at this dispute and wondering, do they need to choose? And if they have to choose, who do they choose? And for many, it's not us. They see us in decline, they see more money, fewer rules coming from a relationship with countries like China, and they see in some respects autocracy as a more appropriate recipe for running your society in the world in which we live in. Now, we've dealt with great power confrontation before in history, and people talk about the Thucydides trap, where a declining power, which is the US, is confronted by a rising power, which is China, and in history, in 12 out of 16 occasions, that's resulted in a war. There is no need for this conversation in our world today to be a war, but it's got to be handled well, and part of handling well is about deterrence and making sure you have a voice. However, the thing that multipolar confrontation has never had to deal with before is a world in which our planet is failing to live up to our expectations, our demands, and our abuse of it. And the known effects of population growth, population of 8 billion, and climate change out to about 2050 means, for example, 150 million people who live on the coast will have to move. That the effects of water scarcity by 2050 will affect 4 billion people at some point every year. The pressures on the planet will destabilize how states operate internally, possibly including even China, and absolutely will destabilize the relationships between states. So climate change, the known effects, even if we raise our game quite quickly, is going to provide the tableau on which multipolar conflict plays out. And that is a very difficult combination. But it's not it. Because we now live in the digital age, it's changing how we live, work and play. It's going to change even more so how we confront and how we fight. And that means that the way states cooperate and compete and confront and conflict is going to be as transformed with opportunities and risks by the digital age, just like anything else in industry or supply chains or whatever it is that you do. So those three things in combination. And then we need to talk about nuclear weapons, because we failed to contain proliferation. And we're now in a world, and you can see it in your newspapers today, reporting from Russia, where the idea of using tactical, so small nuclear weapons, in a conventional conflict in and around Ukraine is seen by Russia, by some in Russia, as an entirely plausible and even reasonable and necessary thing to do. It hasn't happened, but it could. Most people think that's a bad place to be, and there is no necessary link between the use of a tactical nuclear weapon and global extinction, provided you can manage that process of escalation. So if you bundle all of that together, whatever happens in the rest of your natural lives, you are now living in a world that will be conditioned by that, where those comfortable assumptions about how we live and how secure we are and how prosperous we are and the choices that we want to make about the things that we discuss, our values, that kind of thing, are going to be conditioned by this in a world where we don't have a voting majority. We're only, in Europe, 500 million, and there are going to be 5 billion others in places like Asia. And for many in the world, the advantages in the way we live now, which they see on their phones, are very much the things that they would like to have, even at our expense. That's a natural human response. And then there's this aspect of existential risk, which is, after 30 years off of really having to worry about this, we need to talk about the nature of war. Now, I'm required to talk about General Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military theorist, but actually he did say some things that have endured, and one of them was, across the course of human history, the nature of war, what it is as a part of the human condition, that never changes. How war fought, of course that changes all the time with circumstances, thinking and technology, we're going to come on to that. But we're being reminded about the nature of war every day when you look at Ukraine and Gaza and Sudan and Syria and many other places you could mention. And the thing about war is, although many people have tried over centuries, it doesn't have any laws or boundaries or safety nets or guarantees. It's that aspect of the way humans relate to each other which is unbounded and feral and brutal and destructive. And as you see in Ukraine and Gaza, you can spend 300 years building what you'll call a civilization, a built environment, a culture, a way of living. You can smash it apart in 30 seconds with enough high explosive. If you give me the right tools, I can reduce Nottingham to living like people in the Stone Age in about 2 weeks when I take away your water and your power and your supermarkets and your Wi-Fi and your petrol and diesel, and you are just not ready for that. And the point is, when you think about war and its ability to destroy the things that we built up and cherish, and you see that happening in Ukraine, you very much, if you think about it at all, want to believe that couldn't happen here. Well, as a simple matter of military capability, it could happen here this afternoon. A cruise missile launched by Russia at London takes 90 minutes to cross Europe, will arrive with a 500-kilogram warhead to an accuracy of about 2 meters, and it would come probably in groups of about 70, and probably from 360 degrees, it would come from ships and submarines and aircraft. So you can attack the UK in many directions. The undersea cables that support 95% of our economy, well, they are where they are and they're known where they are, so cutting them, not very difficult. And all of these things in combination. So the point is, if we're going to live in an era of existential risk, the homeland, you, are on the pitch every day, and much of this activity is not focused on the armed forces, it's actually focused on industry and civil society. Look at Ukraine. Half of Ukraine's power generation capability is now damaged, some of it, quote, irreversibly, which means it takes more than 5 years to fix. Can you imagine living in the UK with only half of the electricity that we have now? So I'm not saying this is about to happen. What I am absolutely saying, if somebody wanted to do this to us because we were locked in an existential struggle, it can be done today. So maybe we need to be better prepared for deterring that from happening. And that takes me to this point, which is we're used to thinking about war and conflict as something outsourced to the regular armed forces, because that was essentially true through Bosnia, Iraq and Afghanistan, including some very distinguished contributions from reserves, largely as individuals rather than as formed units. But when we think about dealing with existential risk, and you look at Ukraine as a decent model, or indeed Russia, nations fight wars. And I'm going to return to this theme in a couple of ways. So when we think about the world we've got to live in, it's not a question of just saying, okay, so we've got an army, a navy and an air force, an army of 73,000. We've got to think about all the other things a government must do, and increasingly about all the things where the real power in society lies, which is in the private sector, which is you. So that's manufacturing, services, law, culture, so sports, cinema, TV, all of the things that make the UK powerful in the world come from the private sector. The armed forces are a tiny aspect of that. If you look at Russia today, it's a mobilizing economy. It's essentially an oil field making tanks and shells, spending 8% of its GDP on defense. That is a road to economic madness. It's still doing it. And it means to do it not just because of Ukraine, but because of its relationship with us. And there's no seam between what the private sector does, which is providing a load of money and stuff, and what the government does and what the armed forces do. And we are in a really different place. So what is coming in the world that we now live in, and I keep saying we didn't choose it, but we got it. What is coming is this discussion about how civil society, in all its glory, is connected to defence and national security, or we lose. So let's look at some current lessons with that in mind. And the first thing is, and this is really based on Ukraine, if you look at what's happened in Ukraine just since 2022, it represents our massive failure in strategic deterrence. So it was always likely that Russia would be tempted to have another go at a bit of Ukraine, given what it had done in 2014. And we absolutely failed to equip Ukraine with the military capability to deter, because it could defeat the Russian invasion that was coming. But much more than that, we, NATO essentially, failed to deter Russia from thinking it could get away from it. And we relied mostly on hope and denial, and that wasn't a great strategy. Everything that has happened in Ukraine since February 22, which now includes $500 billion of damage to the Ukrainian economy, Russian military casualties alone now of 500,000 killed and wounded, at least 60,000 amputees in Ukraine alone, and the prospect of 50,000 killed and wounded from Ukraine for every year they continue to fight this war. All of things, all of that was avoidable if we had done deterrence properly. So that ought to condition how we think about what we do next. So which is why we've ended up in the place we are now, where we have a tiny pile of stuff and we have no industrial production to kick in really quickly. And now we've got a big war in Ukraine and we have a major confrontation with Russia. And if you see the war in Ukraine and the way it's played out, by about autumn last year, both sides have exhausted the stuff they had on the shelf or they could find around the world. And this is now a war of production, which, as it happens today, Russia is winning. And it really shouldn't, but it's winning it today. And if you really bring that back to the UK, when you think about war, you have to know how much stuff you have to have on the shelf and pay for it, and it's got to be enough. And that's a big problem. But more than that, you have to know how civil society and industry kick in when you need to ramp up production of things like spares and ammunition and, yes, missiles and boots and helmets. That's not a way of thinking we've had to trouble ourselves with since 1989. And then let's drop down to land capability. And the first point is, and I hope by now this isn't a surprise, if you thought that war was fought by the regular armed forces and the reserves if you chose to mobilise them, absolutely not the case. Big wars fought, won and lost by the mobilisation of civil society and industry. We've got to work out how to do that again in order to deter, because deterrence relies on the credible ability to fight. That means reserve. So if you take the army in Ukraine, it's about 800,000 people in uniform now. The regular Ukrainian army when the war started was about 100,000, and they've taken a lot of casualties. So most of the people on the front line in Ukraine for Ukraine are you. They were people who had normal civilian occupations who, when Russia attacked, ended up volunteering to be mobilized, and now they're going to have to do more compulsory mobilization. The interesting thing about the mobilization of civil society in Ukraine is that they sent their dads. It's the oldest country in Europe. Average age on the front line is 43, and they decided to send the dads to protect their youth. Most countries, most of the time, don't do that. They send the youth because they think they're immortal and they don't have families, and you can breed some more a bit quicker. It's a really difficult recipe for Ukraine. But that thought, big wars, existential wars for the survival of the state, not fought by the armed forces, fought, won and lost by you, and that means you need a big and healthy reserve. The second thing is a bit more technical, which is up to about 2014, people were trying to convince people like me, well, A, we weren't going to fight anymore, but when we did, there'd be a bit of cyber and some furious tweeting would go on, and that was how you would fight war in the 21st century. Absolutely not the case. The war in Ukraine dominated by firepower, artillery, air power, air and defense missiles, that kind of thing. In that brutal, feral way. So when people say, oh, the war in Ukraine, oh, it looks a lot like the First World War, well, it does. Because if you've got artillery, you're going to dig a hole, you're going to want an armoured vehicle. It's going to feel just the same, but now with drones, more of which in a minute. The point about air and missile defence there is that we haven't got any. So you know of Iron Dome that sits over Israel. You've seen how Kyiv has been reasonably successful in protecting itself against ballistic and cruise missiles. You've probably observed how they don't have enough air defence over their front line to keep Russian missiles, including these devastating so-called glide bombs, away, even though they only have a range of about 40 kilometres. You have no defence of London. So what you've seen happen in Ukraine could happen to London in spades, and unless we choose to deter that by re-establishing integrated air and missile defence. That'll cost you about £4 billion, by the way, and we haven't got £4 billion. But it is a key indication of if you live in the world I'm describing to you, we're going to have to think about additional forms of capability as well as filling out the stuff that we're maybe more familiar with. The penultimate point on that slide I'm going to come on to a bit more in a minute because we're going to talk about the role of technology, but the thought to put in your mind now is if you think how you live and work and play has been changed by the digital age, well, obviously it's going to change how you do an army, a navy, and air force and glue it all together. But the second thought I want to put in your mind is all the talent that knows how to do that is in civil society, it's not in uniform. We'll come back to that. And the final point there is, in the absence of an existential peril after 1990 or so, we were able to chop up the armed forces and only have a bit of it at readiness at any one time, which is one of the reasons you could have a smaller reserve. So you might have a brigade ready now and you'd have another one training and you'd have another one basically on dull jobs. That isn't going to work in this world. We're going to have to recreate armed forces, including a healthy reserve, which is nearly already enough all of the time to deter. That's a completely different model. There is almost nobody serving in uniform today who remembers how to do that because we stopped doing it in 1989. So now let's talk about technology. And there's a whole range of things, none of which I can see in my tiny notes here, so I'm going to have a look at this. Okay, so the first two things, and you can see examples in Ukraine, is that one of the reasons that the war is different, and any war we fight will be different, is there have been two profound changes. And these are processes, they're not events. The first is the world is now transparent. It's transparent from space and from data. So we watched the Russian invasion force form up from about April 2021, and the US-led intelligence community knew by November 21 for sure Russia was going to attack. They didn't know when, and they didn't know what the plan would be. They certainly didn't know it was going to be so incompetently executed, but they knew they were going to attack. The point is that roughly half the Western world's leaders chose to ignore the intelligence. And therefore what happened in February 22 was a completely unwarranted surprise. So you cannot now do two things. You can't organise an Army and Navy Air Force in its home bases and expect not to be spotted. You can't move it anywhere in the world. You can't position it before you attack without being spotted. It's just not possible. And the second thing is, because you can see it, you can hit it. Because the digital age has provided us with precision weapons with ranges of thousands of kilometres, targeted from assets often in space, which means if you spend all your money on on things you can see, ships, tanks, aircraft, bases, logistic dumps, headquarters, if it can be seen, and it can, then it can be hit with great precision if you have enough of those types of weapons. So our Army, Navy, Air Force and everybody else's is having to rethink how they operate on the basis of transparency and precision. And I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to bundle the rest of that together. So we talk about the Internet of Things, so data driven by artificial intelligence, connected by networks, and increasingly operating robotic or autonomous systems in the way that we shop, travel, run health services, that kind of thing. And that's where militaries are going. So I'm going to talk now about some of the inversions. And the reason I want to talk about that is for two reasons. One is that you're going to pay for this, but when you do it well, it'll actually make the armed forces cheaper. But secondly, technical skill and the people who know how to operate these new armed forces are all going to come from the reserve, in the broader sense I've defined it as. These skills do not exist in the regular military. They understand the problem they're trying to solve, but they don't understand the technology and where that is going. So let's talk about that. So these are really difficult if you spent your life in the armed forces so far. The first thing is, and this is mostly, I guess, for an army audience, is that when you think about fighting, you tend to think about fighting at ranges out to about 10 kilometers, maybe 15 kilometers, because that's the limit of your weapons and the ranges that you can see. But as you can see in many examples from the war in Ukraine and the disquiet in the Middle East, war is actually being fought at much greater ranges. You're trying to defeat your enemy at ranges of hundreds and even thousands of kilometers. That's transparency and precision. So that's going to cause armies, navies, to reshape and need different skills. The second inversion is we're used to thinking about an army, navy and air force, and they're quite independently minded, and then they come together as a sort of, frankly, come as you are party in a joint force. And the digital age won't allow that to happen. In the future, capability is going to be plugged into a common digital backbone of data, AI, astonishingly the immersive simulation and networks. So we're no longer going to buy a ship, tank or aircraft, and actually we're probably no longer going to buy ships, tanks and aircraft, but we're not going to buy platforms and then stick a radio in it and call it connected. We're going to do that the other way round. And the armed forces won't be able to have their own individual networks. It'll have to be a common one. So we're going to invert how we think about designing an armed force. That inversion relies on an understanding of technology that only exists in the civil sector. The fourth point, I think there's some representatives from big firms like Rolls-Royce and others in the room, is that we're used to thinking about armed forces as these iconic platforms, ships, tanks, aircraft carriers, that kind of thing. So essentially platforms manned by people. And the UK and others have programs that run out to 2040 that assume that's going to continue. It's absolutely not going to continue, because every Army, Navy and Air Force of a developed state will evolve through a manned, unmanned and increasingly autonomous mix of capability. And in there is great operational advantage and also much better use of resources. The technology that drives the evolution of manned to unmanned and autonomous all comes from the civil sector, in the same way that Google and others are making autonomous driverless cars. Some big ethical issues around this, like how do you allow a machine to kill a human without a human being in the loop? Well, we already have those weapons. They're mostly defensive. But you, and I do mean you, are going to have to confront a world where you can make a choice. We can make machines autonomous lethal weapon systems that go into battle, and within the limits of their programming and the control systems that sit over them, that they will kill an enemy automatically. And people say, well, that's a bit uncomfortable. Yeah, well, I can send your children to do that instead if you prefer. And at that point, most people think, oh, there's something in autonomy here. And everyone's going to go down that road. And the coming defence review, whoever comes into government and whenever they do it, is going to chart that path. When they chart that path, the engineering skill to think about it is in industry. And the people who can think about how to apply it and operate it will mostly be in the reserve. And the regular forces do not have those skills. And that brings me to the final point on that slide, which is, if you think about the Second World War, and indeed the Cold War, we went through a time when technology was developed through military R&D, quite focused. And then some of it, like GPS and the internet, was then taken back into civil society. The transformation we're talking about now is absolutely the reverse of that, where all the technology and the understanding of it exists in civil society, and it is going to be applied into the military. And that will change not just equipment, but also organisation and ways of working. So cherished organisations in the military developed over 300 years are going to be blown away by the need to operate differently. That's an interesting conversation where the reserve, in the widest sense, becomes profoundly important. So let me conclude. And now I want to talk specifically about the reserve. And the first thing is that there is nothing about the world I've described to you which means the UK can prevail unless at the heart of it we have this unshakable warrior spirit in uniform, but also much more in civil society. Because the benchmark is set by your opposition, who can be cunning and ruthless and cruel and determined, and maybe have less to lose. This is an uncomfortable conversation. There are many examples in the history of UK society rising to that moment, the Second World War being amongst the favourites. We're going to have to do this again. This is going to require some hardening. And then all of these points will matter. So when we talk about the reserve, big wars fought, won and lost by civil society, when we talk about what we do with your money, what you do with your money, you should only have something in uniform full time if you need it every day, or it's so complex that it's someone's full-time job, or you need it for mobilisation. And the fact is, when you approach constructing an Army, Navy, Air Force on that basis, and you look at technology which mostly comes in a box, which is really complicated, but the use of it is really simple, and maybe that technology like air and defence of the UK, or long-range precision fires, or many other things like protecting UK undersea cables, you might not need that every day. So it should be in the reserve. It's not going to be the reserves we have today, it's going to be a completely refashioned reserve. That's about basic value for money. It's not part of our current lived experience, but it absolutely reflects our history. The third point about this is, with the advent of capability, I've cited here things like UAVs and air defence missiles. They're going to be cheaper to buy the more autonomous they become, and they're going to be cheaper to own, and they are going to be things that many countries need. So one aspect of growing a greater reserve capability is not just going to be how you do things that are of interest to the UK, they're also going to be of interest to all the people the UK works with in collective security. In other words, in transforming UK defence around a healthy reserve, there is a direct link to export-led prosperity with our allies, particularly given the reference point that the UK Armed Forces hold amongst many of our European partners. And then I'll run the two final points there together. The first point is, some people join the reserve to do with the armed forces the thing they don't do at work. So they want to run up a mountain carrying military luggage with a knife between their teeth, because they don't do that at work. We're still going to need people who want to do that, probably just going to need more of them. But we're also going to need an awful lot of people who do in the armed forces what they do at work, because that's where the experience in data and AI and autonomy and robotics, precision, transparency, bioscience and a whole host of other things. And so when we talk about refashioning the reserve, there is this direct connection of people and therefore their employers in how you rethink and rebuild effective and sustainably affordable military capability. That's a direct consequence of the fact that the technology that modern armed forces need is going to be an application of stuff that's been developed in the civil sector. And then we're going to have to talk about numbers. There is no way that the tiny armed forces that you ended up with at the end of the post-Cold War are going to be big enough, resilient enough to play their part in the reset of collective deterrence in NATO. But because NATO isn't about to go to war tomorrow, you're not going to want to pay a lot of people in the regular forces to be ready all the time, every day out there. You're going to have to think about how you do mobilization to restore mass through a combination of new technology and reserves. And that, I'm sure, will feature in the coming review. So as UK citizens, in order to secure yourselves, your families, in your communities, you are going to have to commit to a far bigger role for the reserves in the armed forces than we've had in lived experience. And I won't dwell on most of it because it's a bit technical, but I want to just dwell on really where we are now. So if you follow the line of argument I've put to you, and we now live in a different place, and the current defence recipe won't work, and the transformation that we need to do is going to require people in the shape of employers and reserves, then we're still in a very odd place that this is understood by people like me and the service chiefs. It's not universally warmly welcomed in bits of the regular armed forces because it's not in their habit. But it's not going to happen unless you engage, because we're in this odd place where our politicians, for the most part, worrying about many other things. Look at the discourse around the election campaign underway now. And for the most part, civil society is still running on worrying about the cost of living and the struggles of the NHS and potholes. And the politicians don't move until they sense civil society wants it. And civil society would prefer to be led by politicians who could tell them these hard truths, confront them, and give you hard choices. But that's electoral suicide, so that isn't going to happen either. And the importance of this organisation here, and I keep needing to remind you there isn't another one like this, is that employers in particular who are minded to support the armed forces, and silver and gold and all of that are a presupposition of continued engagement and effort, then in order to get to the right place for the country, the debate I have just put to you has to be something that you engage in at work, across the dinner table, in your discussions with local, regional and national politicians. We have to build a consensus as a civil society that in order to secure our security, to advance our prosperity, sustain our values in a much harder world, we need to rebuild our defence and security in the way that I've described to you. I can tell you, because I've been doing it for 45 years, anything I say that has me has almost no traction. But when an employer of a even small, let alone big industry says we'd like to participate in this, it has a much bigger impact. So I come back to where I started, which is I'm really grateful for the chance to talk to you today. If I've unsettled you, I meant to. It's important, but my trip here today will have been for naught if you don't engage in this process. It's after all about your defence and security as much as it is about mine. Thank you very much.